It was a bright Monday morning in the small, bustling town of Oak Ridge. The courthouse stood tall and stoic against the blue sky, surrounded by the usual morning chaos of people hurrying to their jobs and students laughing on their way to school. Justice Arthur Johnson, a distinguished black judge in his late 50s, was driving into the courthouse parking lot, just as he had for the past 20 years. Johnson was a beloved figure in Oak Ridge. His reputation as a fair, wise, and compassionate judge had made him a respected pillar of the community. Known for his deep voice, calm demeanor, and dedication to justice, he had made countless difficult decisions that had shaped Oak Ridge, earning the respect of nearly everyone who crossed his path. Today felt no different. Another day filled with cases and hearings, another day serving justice. As Justice Johnson turned into the parking lot, he noticed a young police officer standing near the entrance, clipboard in hand, his stern gaze scanning each car that entered. The officer, Bradley Connor, was new to the force, fresh out of training and eager to prove himself. Connor was in his late 20s, ambitious and eager to enforce the law by the book. He had grown up in a neighboring town and wasn't fully familiar with Oak Ridge or its people, nor did he understand the unique relationships and dynamics that had grown in this small town over the years. To him, everyone was subject to the same treatment, no exceptions, though his stern approach and tendency to make quick assumptions had already raised some eyebrows in the community. Johnson parked his car, stepped out, and gathered his files, preparing to start his day. Just as he began to walk toward the courthouse entrance, Officer Connor's voice rang out sharply. "Excuse me, sir. Hold on a moment." The judge, slightly surprised, turned to see Connor approaching him with an intense, scrutinizing look in his eyes. Johnson assumed it was a routine check, perhaps a polite greeting to help the new officer feel comfortable. But as Connor approached, his eyes narrowed, and his expression turned hard. "May I see some ID, sir?" he demanded, his tone brisk and unyielding. Taken aback, Justice Johnson hesitated. He wasn't used to being questioned so directly in the place where he had worked for decades, but he calmly reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his ID card. "Here you go, officer," he said, maintaining his usual calm composure. Connor took the ID, barely glancing at it before asking, "And what business do you have here today?" The question, simple as it may have sounded, carried an edge that unsettled Johnson. He looked around, noticing the few courthouse staff who had begun to notice the interaction. "I'm a judge here," Johnson replied, maintaining his composure, though a slight tension crept into his voice. "I work here, officer." Connor raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. His eyes scanned Johnson up and down, as though trying to detect any sign of deception. "Aha," Connor said skeptically. "And what's your name, Judge?" "Arthur Johnson," he replied, his voice steady. Connor tapped his clipboard, glancing back at Johnson's ID with an air of suspicion. "Interesting," he said slowly, "because we haven't had a black judge here before. At least, none that I've seen." There was an audible silence as those nearby realized what Connor was implying. Johnson held his gaze, his years of experience allowing him to maintain his composure, though inside, frustration simmered. "Perhaps if you had been here longer, you would know who I am," he responded carefully. Connor's jaw tightened, his pride clearly pricked. "Just doing my job, sir," he replied, emphasizing the last word, as if Johnson's status was somehow suspect. "You know, there's a lot of people who'd like to get into this courthouse for the wrong reasons." More courthouse staff had gathered, and several were starting to pull out their phones. A few murmured to each other, some visibly uncomfortable as they watched the scene unfold. Johnson noticed his longtime assistant, Miriam, watching with a look of growing worry. The sight of his staff, people who had worked with him for years, standing helplessly by, made Johnson's heart sink. This was his courthouse, his community, yet here he was, being treated as a stranger, questioned as though he were some intruder. In that moment, Johnson felt a weight that went beyond his personal discomfort. It was the weight of a long history of prejudices, misunderstandings, and assumptions that had followed him throughout his life. He had worked his whole career to earn the trust and respect of his community, yet here he was, facing the same doubt and suspicion he had spent decades fighting against. But he knew this moment was not just about him. It was a moment that everyone around him, his staff, the bystanders, and the officer himself, would remember. "Officer Connor," Johnson said finally, his voice calm but firm, "I've been serving as a judge here for over 20 years. This courthouse is practically my second home." Connor crossed his arms, the disbelief in his expression unyielding. "I'm going to have to run a check," he said, pulling out his radio and stepping back a few feet, casting another scrutinizing glance at Johnson. As Connor spoke into his radio, his voice loud and assertive, the crowd murmured louder, and Johnson could feel the atmosphere shifting. People were no longer just curious. They were visibly disturbed by what they were witnessing. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. "That's the judge," someone said. "Doesn't he know who he's talking to?" Another whispered. A courthouse guard, finally recognizing the escalating situation, approached Connor. "Officer Connor, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said cautiously, glancing between the two men. But Connor brushed him off with a dismissive wave. "Sir, please stay out of this. I have protocol to follow," he said sharply, his voice filled with authority and irritation. Johnson could feel the eyes on him, the weight of this spectacle growing heavier by the second. He took a deep breath, choosing his next words carefully. "Officer, I've answered your questions. I've provided my identification. There are people here who can verify my identity." His voice held an unmistakable firmness, a quiet but powerful assertion of his right to be respected and treated fairly. Yet even as he spoke, he could see that Connor's mind was already made up, that his decision to doubt and challenge Johnson was rooted in something deeper than mere procedure. Connor's superior, Lieutenant Warren, soon arrived, having been called by concerned staff. He approached with an air of authority, nodding toward Johnson and then addressing Connor. "Officer Connor, is there an issue here?" Connor straightened, clutching his clipboard tightly. "This gentleman claims to be a judge here, sir, but I couldn't verify that. I wanted to be thorough." Lieutenant Warren glanced at Johnson, a look of recognition dawning on his face. He turned back to Connor, frowning. "This is Justice Johnson. There's no need to detain him," he said quietly but firmly. Connor's face paled slightly, though his jaw remained clenched. "I was just trying to do my job, sir," he mumbled, though there was a hint of embarrassment creeping into his tone. The lieutenant looked at him sternly. "Doing your job also means knowing who you're talking to and respecting the community you're here to serve." Connor's face flushed with anger and shame, his pride wounded in front of the growing crowd. But the damage was done. The crowd had seen, the phones had recorded, and Justice Johnson had endured a moment he would never forget. As he walked past Officer Connor, the words of his past echoed in his mind, a mix of hard-won pride and bittersweet frustration. He had fought for his place in this world, his dignity, and his right to be seen as he was, yet here he was, reminded that assumptions and prejudices could still strip him of that respect in an instant. Yet, as he passed by the officer, he did not speak words of anger or frustration. Instead, he looked at him and said, "We're all part of this community, officer. Remember that." With those words, he walked into the courthouse, the murmurs following him like whispers of a story that would not be easily forgotten. Justice Arthur Johnson was not born with power or privilege. His journey to the courthouse bench in Oak Ridge was a hard-won battle, one that had taken him through decades of struggles, sacrifices, and resilience. Born in a small, underserved neighborhood on the other side of town, Arthur had grown up in a tight-knit community, a place where everyone knew everyone and survival meant working twice as hard for half as much. His father was a factory worker, pulling long shifts to support the family, while his mother took on various odd jobs, never letting exhaustion dim her warmth and kindness. From a young age, Arthur was drawn to books, seeking an escape from the limitations of his world through the pages that opened up new ideas, dreams, and possibilities. The neighborhood was rough, Crime was high, and opportunities were few. Arthur saw many of his childhood friends pulled into cycles of poverty and crime, drawn by the allure of quick money or desperate to escape their circumstances. But his mother had always encouraged him to keep his head high, to believe in his potential, and to rise above the struggles surrounding him. She would often say, "Son, remember, the world can judge you for what they see, but you must always know your own worth." Those words, simple yet profound, became his guiding force. Arthur's academic prowess became apparent as he worked his way through school, often staying up late to study by the dim light of a lamp, driven by an ambition that seemed almost otherworldly to those around him. He was determined not to be defined by his background or limited by the expectations that society placed on him. His teachers took notice, and eventually, with their guidance and his mother's encouragement, he earned a scholarship to a prestigious law school. This was a monumental achievement for Arthur, and even though the transition was tough, he knew that this was his chance to prove that he was more than the labels and assumptions often attached to him. Law school was a transformative experience for Arthur, but it was also isolating. He was often the only black student in his classes, and the subtle, sometimes overt, reminders of his outsider status were a constant companion. He had to work harder, prove himself again and again, and navigate spaces where he felt his every move was scrutinized. But rather than letting it deter him, he used these experiences to sharpen his understanding of justice and prejudice. His encounters with biases, both implicit and explicit, fueled his resolve to become a lawyer who would advocate for those who felt voiceless, marginalized, or unseen. Upon graduation, Arthur returned to Oak Ridge, driven by a desire to give back to the community that had shaped him. His career began as a public defender, representing clients who couldn't afford a lawyer, many of whom came from backgrounds similar to his own. It was grueling work, often thankless, and Arthur found himself questioning the very system he had once idolized. But as the years passed, he became a beacon of hope for those who felt abandoned by the legal system. He became known for his compassion, his patience, and his unwavering belief that everyone deserved a fair chance. His reputation grew, and eventually he was nominated to serve as a judge, a historic moment for the town, as Arthur became the first black judge to hold such a position in Oak Ridge. His journey had been anything but easy, and even after years of serving on the bench, he was aware that his presence in the courthouse made him a target for scrutiny. Yet, Justice Johnson held himself with quiet dignity, understanding that every day he sat in that courtroom, he was breaking barriers, not just for himself, but for those who would come after him. He had become a mentor to young law students, an advocate for community reform, and a voice for change within the justice system. People in Oak Ridge trusted him, respected him, and looked up to him as someone who had defied the odds and fought for what was right. Officer Bradley Connor, on the other hand, had a very different story. Bradley had grown up in a suburban neighborhood, a place where crime was low and most families lived comfortably. His father was a retired police officer, and from a young age, Bradley idolized him, often tagging along to community events where his father was celebrated as a local hero. Bradley's upbringing was steeped in tales of honor, justice, and the importance of keeping the peace. However, his understanding of these values was narrow, shaped by his limited experiences and a somewhat rigid view of the world. He saw things in black and white, right and wrong, and had little patience for gray areas or complexities. To him, law and order were straightforward concepts, and his duty was to enforce them, no questions asked. After completing police training, Bradley chose to work in Oak Ridge, thinking it would be a chance to serve a community that needed strong, decisive policing. He was ambitious, eager to make his mark, and like his father, wanted to be seen as a hero. However, his approach was often abrasive, and his attempts to assert authority sometimes bordered on intimidation. He rarely took the time to understand the people he served, and his assumptions often clouded his judgment. He didn't see individuals with unique stories or backgrounds. He saw rules that needed to be enforced and lines that shouldn't be crossed. As Bradley patrolled Oak Ridge, he found himself confronted with people and situations that challenged his perceptions. He encountered families struggling with poverty, young people caught in cycles of disadvantage, and older residents who had lived through decades of social change. Yet, he remained steadfast in his views, convinced that his approach was the only way to maintain order. Bradley didn't realize it, but his rigidity was creating rifts between him and the community, and his reputation as a no-nonsense officer quickly transformed into one of an inflexible enforcer. On the morning that he stopped Justice Johnson, Bradley had already made up his mind about the judge based on nothing more than a glance. The sight of a well-dressed black man arriving at the courthouse was enough for him to raise his guard. His upbringing had instilled in him an unconscious bias that he didn't even realize he held, a perception of danger or untrustworthiness that he had never questioned. Bradley's sense of authority, combined with his lack of familiarity with the diverse community of Oak Ridge, led him to act on instinct rather than reason. As Bradley interrogated Justice Johnson in the courthouse parking lot, he was, in essence, acting out a lifetime of biases and assumptions. To him, this was just another routine interaction, another moment of asserting his role as a protector of law and order. But to Johnson, this was a painful reminder that despite his achievements and years of service, he could still be reduced to a mere stereotype in the eyes of those who failed to see beyond their own preconceptions. The incident in the parking lot wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a collision of two worlds, two histories, and two vastly different perspectives on justice and identity. As Johnson stood there, subjected to doubt and suspicion, he felt the weight of his own journey, the years of fighting against prejudice, the countless cases where he had defended the rights of others, and the quiet but constant battle to be seen for who he truly was, beyond the labels and biases that others imposed on him. Meanwhile, Bradley, oblivious to the significance of the moment, continued his scrutiny, unaware that this encounter would be a turning point not only for Justice Johnson, but also for himself. In that brief interaction, the lives of two men from opposite sides of the same town, shaped by different experiences and expectations, intersected in a way that would soon ripple through the entire community. By the time Lieutenant Warren arrived to defuse the situation, the seeds of something far larger had already been planted. Johnson knew this moment would leave a mark, not just on him, but on Oak Ridge itself. The parking lot confrontation was over, but its impact was only beginning to unfold. And for Officer Bradley Connor, the realization that he had made a grave miscalculation would come slowly, a painful truth that would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, fairness, and his place in the community he was supposed to serve. This incident was about to open a new chapter for Oak Ridge, one that would force everyone, from courthouse staff to townsfolk, to confront uncomfortable questions about bias, respect, and the meaning of true justice. For Justice Johnson, it was a bitter reminder of the work still left to be done, not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts and minds of those who carried hidden prejudices. As Justice Johnson entered the courthouse, he could feel the eyes of everyone around him, following his every move. The air was thick with tension. Whispers filled the hallways, and the expressions on his colleagues' faces told him that the incident outside had already spread like wildfire through the courthouse staff. Those who knew him, his colleagues, clerks, even the janitors and bailiffs, looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. They knew how tirelessly he had worked, not only as a judge, but as a symbol of progress and fairness in Oak Ridge. They knew the depth of his dedication to this town, yet today they had watched him be treated as if he were nothing more than a stranger, a suspect. Justice Johnson walked purposefully, his footsteps echoing in the quiet halls as he made his way to his chambers. He was visibly shaken, but his composure never faltered. He had learned long ago that moments like this, moments where his worth was questioned, required a steady hand and a calm exterior. As he closed the door behind him, however, a heaviness settled over him. It was a familiar weight, the same one he had carried since his youth, the one that reminded him he would always have to work harder, stay calmer, and prove himself beyond a shadow of a doubt, even in spaces he dedicated his life to. Not long after, his longtime assistant, Miriam, entered his chambers. She had worked with him for over a decade, becoming not only his most trusted assistant, but also a friend who had seen him through countless cases, victories, and hardages. Miriam, who was in her 60s, understood the weight that moments like this held. She had her own stories of bias and prejudice, and she felt a deep anger on his behalf. She looked at him, her face lined with concern, as she placed a cup of tea on his desk. "Arthur," she began gently, dropping the formalities they typically adhered to within the courthouse walls. "I can't believe what I just saw out there. After everything you've done for this town, to be treated like that, it's unacceptable." Her voice trembled slightly, her usual composed demeanor slipping in the face of her anger. Justice Johnson gave her a faint, tired smile. "It's the reality we live in, Miriam," he replied, his voice calm but tinged with a weariness that spoke of years of similar experiences. "Today was just a reminder that no matter what I achieve, I will still be judged by the color of my skin before my character." Miriam reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You shouldn't have to keep proving yourself, Arthur. Not here. Not in this courthouse." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Lieutenant Warren, the officer who had intervened outside. He stepped into the room, looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable. He cleared his throat, visibly searching for the right words. "Judge Johnson, I wanted to apologize for what happened outside. Officer Connor, he's new, and he didn't realize who you were." Justice Johnson looked at Warren, his expression thoughtful. "Lieutenant, this isn't about him not recognizing me. It's about him assuming that I didn't belong here." "That assumption, Warren, isn't just a matter of being new. It's a matter of perspective, of bias." Warren's discomfort deepened as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He had known Johnson for years and respected him deeply, but he realized, perhaps for the first time, that he hadn't truly considered the daily battles Johnson faced. "I understand, Judge," Warren finally replied, though his tone hinted at a reluctance to fully grasp the depth of what Johnson was saying. "I'll talk to Connor and make sure he knows who everyone in this building is." Johnson let out a sigh, his eyes meeting Warren's with a look that seemed to convey years of unspoken pain and frustration. "Warren, this isn't just about recognizing faces. It's about changing the assumptions that lead to these kinds of confrontations. It's about understanding that authority doesn't give us the right to judge someone's character before we know them. This young officer needs to learn that, or he'll keep making the same mistakes with people who might not have the voice to speak out." Warren nodded slowly, his eyes finally reflecting a glimmer of understanding. He had seen the incident in the parking lot as an unfortunate mishap, an oversight that could be corrected with a memo or a quick meeting. But as he stood there, looking at Justice Johnson, he began to understand that this was about more than one officer's lack of recognition. It was a systemic issue, a deeply ingrained problem that affected how people like Officer Connor viewed the world, especially those who didn't look like them. The day moved forward, but the weight of the morning's incident lingered heavily over Justice Johnson. When he finally took his seat on the bench, the courtroom was filled with people, some of whom had witnessed the confrontation outside. As he presided over cases, he noticed the glances, the whispered conversations, the subtle nods of support from those who knew what had happened. Each case was handled with his usual care, but his mind kept drifting back to the parking lot, replaying the interaction in his mind. He wondered how many others had faced similar confrontations, how many had been silenced by assumptions and biases that ran as deep as they were invisible. During the lunch break, a group of community leaders arrived at the courthouse to speak with him. They were concerned, upset by what they had heard, and wanted to discuss ways to address the underlying issues that had led to the incident. They spoke about the need for better training, for open conversations on race and bias within the police force, and for a commitment to understanding and respecting the community they served. Justice Johnson listened intently, nodding, grateful for their support, but also cautious. He knew that real change wouldn't come from a single meeting or a few well-meaning discussions. It would require a fundamental shift in the way people viewed one another, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and dismantle the invisible barriers that separated them. By the end of the day, news of the incident had spread beyond the courthouse. A local journalist who had been outside that morning published a piece recounting the confrontation, framing it as a stark reminder of the biases that persisted even in a town as seemingly progressive as Oak Ridge. The article was shared widely, sparking a wave of reactions from the community. Some were outraged, calling for accountability within the police force, while others defended Officer Connor, insisting he was only doing his job. The town found itself divided, with heated conversations taking place in cafes, schools, and even within families. For Justice Johnson, the aftermath was a double-edged sword. On one hand, he was deeply moved by the support he received, the messages from community members who shared their own stories of prejudice and discrimination. But on the other hand, he felt the strain of the divide that had opened up. People who had once been united were now arguing, torn between defending the police and calling for reform. Johnson knew that these divisions could deepen if not handled carefully, and he felt a responsibility to guide the conversation, to steer it toward understanding and unity. That evening, as he sat alone in his chambers, he thought about the young officer who had stopped him. Bradley Connor had been so sure, so certain of his authority, that he hadn't paused to question his own assumptions. Johnson wondered what it would take to change a mindset like that, to help people see past their biases and approach one another with genuine respect and empathy. He reflected on his own journey, on the countless times he had encountered similar assumptions, and he realized that perhaps this was an opportunity, a painful but necessary chance to spark change. The next day, Justice Johnson called a town meeting, inviting not only community members, but also members of the police force, including Officer Connor and Lieutenant Warren. He knew this meeting could be challenging, that emotions would run high, but he believed it was the only way to begin healing the divide. As he stood before the gathered crowd, he shared his story, not just the incident in the parking lot, but the struggles he had faced throughout his life, the biases he had overcome, and the pain of being reduced to a stereotype despite his accomplishments. The room was silent as he spoke, his words cutting through the tension and reaching the hearts of everyone present. He didn't speak with anger or resentment. Instead, he spoke with a quiet strength, a determination to help his community see the truth of their shared humanity. He urged them to consider the impact of their assumptions, to question the judgments they made about one another, and to work together to create a community where everyone could be seen for who they truly were. Officer Connor, who had been standing in the back of the room, listened intently, his face a mixture of shame and realization. For the first time, he began to see Justice Johnson not as a suspect, not as someone he had the authority to control, but as a man with a story, a history, and a dignity that demanded respect. As the meeting came to a close, Connor approached Justice Johnson, his face pale, his voice barely a whisper. "Judge Johnson," he began, I'm sorry. I didn't see it then, but now, I understand. I'll do better." Justice Johnson looked at him, his expression softened by compassion. "Thank you, Officer Connor. It takes courage to confront our own biases. Let's work together to make sure this is a place where everyone feels they belong." The two men shook hands, a quiet gesture of reconciliation, but one that symbolized a step toward change, a moment of hope for a community that, despite its struggles, was now on a path toward understanding. This was only the beginning. The following weeks were a whirlwind for Justice Johnson and the entire town of Oak Ridge. The town meeting, where Justice Johnson had spoken openly about his experiences, had ignited a movement for change within the community, bringing long-simmering issues to the surface. The courthouse incident had become a catalyst, one that stirred emotions, opinions, and even some resentment among residents, who were divided over what justice and fairness truly meant in their town. For Justice Johnson, The days following the meeting were filled with constant reflection. He had been thrust into a role he never anticipated, an advocate not just for the legal system, but for a cultural shift within his town. He thought back on his years as a judge, the people he'd served, and the responsibility he'd always felt to uphold fairness in his courtroom. But now, he realized, the struggle was larger than the cases he presided over. It was about challenging an entire system of biases and assumptions, about pushing for empathy and understanding in places where they were often overlooked. Officer Bradley Connor's life had changed drastically as well. The incident had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, truths he had never examined before. Raised in a household that had encouraged him to be proud of his authority and to see the world in black and white terms, Bradley had never questioned his perceptions. But now, as he sat alone in his small apartment each evening, he found himself replaying the scene in the parking lot, remembering the look in Justice Johnson's eyes, the quiet pain mixed with resilience. Bradley couldn't shake the shame that had taken root inside him. He realized that his perception of his role as an officer needed to change. He wasn't just there to enforce the law. He was there to protect and serve every member of the community, to respect each person as a human being with a story and a right to be treated with dignity. One morning, compelled by a growing sense of responsibility, Bradley approached his police chief with an idea. "Chief, I think we need to start talking about bias, about how we interact with people in the community," he said, his voice laced with conviction. "What happened with Judge Johnson, it's opened my eyes. And I know I'm not the only one who could use some perspective on this." The chief, initially surprised, studied Bradley's face, noting the genuine regret and determination that had replaced the officer's usual no-nonsense expression. After a pause, the chief nodded. "All right, Connor. Let's see what we can do. Maybe it's time we all take a hard look at how we're serving this town." In the following weeks, the police department in Oak Ridge implemented a series of training programs aimed at addressing implicit bias, encouraging officers to engage with the community on a deeper, more personal level. The first session was held in a local community center, and Justice Johnson was invited to speak. Standing before a room full of officers, Johnson felt the weight of the moment, but he also felt a cautious sense of hope. His words were measured, thoughtful, as he recounted stories from his life, stories that highlighted the subtle yet powerful ways that bias could shape interactions. He challenged the officers to look inward, to examine their own assumptions, and to remember that the people they served weren't just strangers. They were members of the same community, people deserving of respect and understanding. As Johnson spoke, Bradley sat in the front row, his eyes never leaving the judge. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, his expression one of sincere reflection. The session concluded with an open discussion, where officers were encouraged to share their thoughts and experiences. Some were reluctant, others hesitant, but gradually, conversations began to flow. Officers shared their own biases, moments they were proud of, and moments they regretted. It was raw, uncomfortable, but it was necessary. Bradley stood up to speak, his voice faltering at first. "I didn't realize it at the time," he admitted, "but I was making assumptions about Judge Johnson that day. Assumptions that were wrong, that were unfair. I thought I was just doing my job. But now I see that I was letting my own biases get in the way of treating him with the respect he deserved." The room was silent as Bradley spoke, his words resonating with everyone present. The training sessions continued, and over time, the conversations moved beyond the walls of the community center. Officers began connecting with local residents, attending community events, and sitting down with people in casual settings to learn about their lives and perspectives. This new approach, though met with some skepticism initially, started to build a sense of unity and trust that hadn't existed before. People began to see their officers not as enforcers, but as protectors, as members of the same town who cared about their well-being. Justice Johnson, too, felt the shift. For the first time in a long while, He felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps his encounter with Officer Connor had sparked something meaningful, something that could create lasting change. Meanwhile, the media had picked up on Oak Ridge's transformation, and stories began circulating about the town's journey toward confronting bias and building a more connected community. News outlets interviewed Justice Johnson, asking him about the changes he had seen and the impact of the courthouse incident. He spoke with grace and humility, emphasizing that the progress Oak Ridge was making was a collective effort, a movement that was as much about personal reflection as it was about institutional change. "This isn't about me," he would say. "This is about all of us, about creating a place where every person, regardless of their background, can feel safe, respected, and seen." The community felt the impact of this shift as well. People of all ages and backgrounds began attending town meetings, eager to share their own experiences and to participate in the dialogue that Justice Johnson had initiated. Schools organized workshops for students, focusing on empathy, understanding, and the importance of standing up against prejudice. Local businesses displayed signs that read, "Oak Ridge, a town for all," a simple yet powerful message that represented the change that was taking root. Justice Johnson watched these developments with a profound sense of gratitude. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, one that went beyond the courtroom. He had always believed in the power of justice, but now he saw that justice wasn't limited to legal proceedings. It was a value that needed to be embedded in every interaction, every relationship, every choice made within the community. His role had expanded from that of a judge to that of a mentor, a leader who was helping his town redefine what it meant to be a just and equitable place. One evening, as Justice Johnson was locking up his chambers after a long day, he found Officer Connor waiting for him outside. Bradley looked different. There was a humility, an openness in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. "Judge Johnson," he began, his voice steady but earnest, "I just wanted to thank you for not just accepting my apology, but for showing me a different way to look at things. I've been working on myself, on my perspective, and I think I'm starting to get it. I know I have a long way to go, but I want you to know that I'm committed to changing." Justice Johnson nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Growth is a journey, Officer Connor. We all have things we need to work on. The important thing is that you're willing to do the work." They shared a moment of silence, a mutual understanding that spoke louder than any words could. As Connor walked away, Justice Johnson felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that his encounter with the officer had not only transformed the younger man's perspective, but had also planted seeds for a more inclusive, empathetic community. The courthouse parking lot, once the site of a painful confrontation, had become a symbol of Oak Ridge's journey, a place where prejudice had been met with understanding, where division had sparked unity. Justice Johnson, now more than ever, felt a profound sense of peace. He understood that his role as a judge went beyond the courtroom. He was, in many ways, a guardian of his community's values, a guide for those who sought a better, fairer Oak Ridge. And so, Oak Ridge continued to evolve, slowly but surely. The town had faced a moment of reckoning, one that had challenged everyone to look within, to question their assumptions, and to choose compassion over fear. The changes were not immediate, nor were they always easy, but they were steady, rooted in a commitment to justice that transcended laws and rulings. Justice Johnson's legacy, once defined by his rulings and achievements, had grown to include something far more powerful, the legacy of a community united in empathy, respect, and a shared vision of a better future. The aftermath of the incident and the movement that followed had fundamentally reshaped Oak Ridge. Conversations that were once avoided or quietly dismissed had become central topics at dinner tables, community gatherings, and even casual exchanges at local shops. Justice Johnson, though initially reluctant to step into such a visible role, found himself at the heart of these changes. His influence had extended beyond the courthouse walls, sparking a community-wide reflection on identity, bias, and the importance of empathy. He had become not just a judge in the legal sense, but a figure of moral guidance and, in a way, a symbol of what Oakridge could aspire to be, a place where respect and understanding could flourish despite differences. But progress wasn't without its challenges. As Oakridge began to confront these issues, the pushback grew as well. Some people in the town felt threatened by the changes, perceiving them as an attack on traditions or as a challenge to authority. Tensions simmered in some pockets of the community, particularly among those who felt that these discussions about race and bias undermined the hard work of the police force. The department itself was split. While some officers, inspired by Justice Johnson's words, embraced the new training programs and community-building efforts, others resisted, feeling that their role was being questioned and that their authority was being undermined. Officer Bradley Connor, who had been at the center of the original incident, was grappling with his own transformation. After publicly apologizing to Justice Johnson and openly committing to addressing his biases, he faced mixed reactions from his colleagues. Some of the older officers viewed his change of heart with suspicion, while a few younger officers looked up to him, seeing his willingness to reflect and grow as a sign of courage. Bradley's life had been altered in a profound way. The experience had shattered his previous black-and-white worldview, and he was determined to rebuild it with a foundation of understanding, humility, and respect. However, not everyone in the department welcomed these changes. Bradley's mentor, Sergeant Tom Keller, an officer with over 30 years of experience, had a hard time accepting Bradley's newfound perspective. Tom was a respected figure in the police department, known for his tough but fair approach, but he had grown up in a different era, one where policing meant showing authority above all else. He had a hard time reconciling this push for empathy and sensitivity with his idea of maintaining order. During one of their shifts, Tom confronted Bradley, his tone laced with frustration. "Connor," Tom began, his voice low and stern, "I don't understand why you're letting people like Judge Johnson get in your head. We're here to enforce the law, not to play therapist to everyone we meet on the street. What happened to keeping the peace without questioning yourself every second?" Bradley took a deep breath, carefully considering his response. "Tom, it's not about letting anyone get in my head. It's about understanding that there's more to this job than just enforcing rules. We're here to serve the community, all of it, not just the people who look or act a certain way. If I can't see people as individuals, if I judge them before knowing them, then I'm not doing my job right." Tom shook his head, visibly frustrated. "I don't know, Connor. You start questioning everything, and soon you lose control. It's a slippery slope." Bradley, realizing that he might never fully convince Tom, nodded respectfully but firmly. "I understand where you're coming from, but times are changing. We're here to protect and serve, and that means everyone, without exception." The two men exchanged a tense glance, an unspoken agreement that their perspectives would likely remain at odds. But Bradley felt resolute, his commitment to change unwavering. Meanwhile, Justice Johnson continued his efforts to engage the town on a deeper level. At his suggestion, the courthouse began hosting monthly community forums, where residents, law enforcement, and city officials could come together to discuss concerns, share ideas, and address ongoing issues. These forums, moderated by Johnson himself, became a platform for voices that had long gone unheard. Local business owners, teachers, parents, and even students participated, sharing their experiences and offering perspectives that helped bridge gaps in understanding. The forums weren't always peaceful. Some sessions grew heated, with people voicing frustration and anger over issues that had been ignored for years. But Johnson welcomed these moments, believing that meaningful progress required facing uncomfortable truths. During one particularly intense forum, a young woman named Carla, who had recently moved to Oakridge, shared a powerful story about her experience with racial profiling at a neighboring town's grocery store. Her voice trembled as she recounted the humiliation she felt, the looks she received, and the assumption that she was there to steal rather than shop. Her story hit close to home for many in the room, and several people nodded in understanding. Officer Connor, seated in the audience, listened intently, feeling a sense of guilt, but also a renewed sense of responsibility. Carla's story reminded him of his own assumptions in the parking lot with Judge Johnson, and he felt a surge of determination to continue challenging his own biases. The forums also attracted journalists and community organizers from neighboring towns who wanted to learn from Oak Ridge's efforts. Slowly, the story of Oak Ridge's journey began to spread, and other communities reached out, inspired to start similar initiatives. Justice Johnson found himself in demand, invited to speak at conferences and events about Oak Ridge's transformation and the lessons learned from his experiences. Each time, he spoke with humility, emphasizing that change was an ongoing process, that real transformation required continuous effort and a willingness to question one's own beliefs. But not all reactions were positive. Some residents in Oak Ridge felt that the attention brought to the town was unwelcome, that the discussions on bias and prejudice had cast a negative light on their community. A small but vocal group began protesting the forums, accusing Johnson of dividing the town rather than uniting it. They claimed that the focus on racial issues created tension where none had existed, that the town had been peaceful until these outsiders began influencing Oak Ridge's direction. These protests, though relatively small, created ripples of unease, reminding Justice Johnson that his work was far from over. Despite the pushback, the majority of the town stood behind Johnson's vision, supporting his efforts and recognizing the value in addressing these long-standing issues. One of the most significant breakthroughs came during a town hall meeting where Justice Johnson invited high school students to share their thoughts. A young student named Lewis, who was known for his interest in social justice, stood up and delivered a powerful speech about his experiences growing up in Oak Ridge. He spoke about the subtle biases he encountered, the assumptions made about him based on his appearance, and the challenges he faced in asserting his identity. His words were raw, honest, and deeply moving. As he spoke, several people in the audience wiped away tears, touched by his courage and vulnerability. Lewis's speech became a turning point, igniting a wave of support for younger voices in the community. Justice Johnson recognized the importance of empowering the next generation, and he began mentoring a group of students, helping them organize events, workshops, and campaigns that promoted inclusivity and understanding. These young leaders, inspired by Johnson's guidance, took it upon themselves to create a youth council that would represent their peers' perspectives and advocate for continued progress in Oak Ridge. Their enthusiasm and passion reinvigorated the town, bringing a new sense of purpose to the movement. Justice Johnson watched with pride as Oak Ridge transformed, witnessing the impact of collective effort, the power of open dialogue, and the strength of a community willing to confront its own flaws. He saw Officer Connor at nearly every event, always listening, always reflecting, his journey mirroring that of the town's. And though the challenges persisted, though there were still moments of tension and resistance, Oak Ridge had become a place where conversations once avoided were now welcomed, where differences were celebrated rather than feared. One night, as Johnson sat alone in his chambers, he received an unexpected letter from Carla, the young woman who had shared her story of racial profiling. She thanked him for creating a space where her voice could be heard, for giving her the courage to speak up, and for showing her that change was possible even in the face of doubt. Her words filled him with a profound sense of fulfillment, a quiet affirmation that his journey, his struggles, and his resilience had all led to something meaningful, something lasting. Justice Johnson knew that Oak Ridge was far from perfect, that progress was fragile and required constant vigilance. But he also knew that his community had been forever changed, that the seeds of empathy, understanding, and justice had taken root. As he gazed out of his office window, looking over the quiet streets of Oak Ridge, he felt a deep sense of peace. The path ahead would still be challenging, but the town had begun to find its way, guided by the strength of its people, the voices of its youth, and a commitment to building a future where everyone belonged. And in the end, that was all he had ever wanted, to leave a legacy that went beyond rulings and verdicts, to create a community where justice was more than a word, where it was a living, breathing promise. a promise that Oak Ridge would continue to uphold long after he was gone. Months had passed since the initial confrontation in the courthouse parking lot, and the changes in Oak Ridge were undeniable. What had started as a painful, divisive incident had gradually become a rallying point for the town, leading to initiatives and conversations that would have once seemed impossible. The community, despite its share of disagreements and challenges, had begun to embrace a new era of openness and introspection. Justice Arthur Johnson, who had initially been thrust into an unwanted spotlight, now found himself reflecting on the legacy he was leaving behind, not only as a judge, but as a symbol of transformation and resilience. One evening, as Justice Johnson walked through the courthouse halls after a long day, he was approached by Lewis, the high school student who had made such an impact with his speech at the town forum. Lewis had become an active voice for young people in Oak Ridge, organizing student-led discussions, advocating for youth involvement in community issues, and even starting a weekly podcast that featured local stories and explored themes of social justice and understanding. Lewis looked at the judge with admiration and gratitude in his eyes. "Judge Johnson," Lewis began, his voice filled with respect, "I just wanted to say thank you. I know it might sound simple, but what you did, speaking up, sharing your story, it changed everything for us. It gave people like me a chance to be heard. I used to think that change was something that happened somewhere else, that people like me didn't have a voice. But you showed us that we can make a difference, that we can change things right here." Justice Johnson smiled, deeply moved by Lewis's words. "Lewis, seeing young people like you taking charge, raising your voices, and pushing for change, that's what gives me hope. This community is yours as much as it is mine. And if I've done anything to help you believe in your own power, then I consider that my greatest achievement." He placed a hand on Lewis's shoulder. "You keep going. Don't ever let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Officer Bradley Connor, who had been waiting respectfully a few steps away. Bradley, who had undergone his own transformation, had become one of the most vocal advocates for bias training and community engagement within the police department. He had worked tirelessly to mend the fractured relationship between the police force and the community, attending every forum, listening to people's concerns, and showing humility and openness that had once been foreign to him. His reputation had shifted dramatically. He was no longer seen as the rigid, by-the-book officer, but as a man who had come to understand the true meaning of service and respect. As Bradley approached, he looked at Lewis, nodding in acknowledgement before turning to Justice Johnson. "Judge Johnson," he began, his tone earnest, "I just wanted to let you know that I spoke with the chief today, and we've secured funding for a community liaison program. It'll be a bridge between the police department and the community. A team of officers and community members working together to address concerns, mediate conflicts, and keep lines of communication open. It's something I've wanted to do for a while now, but your support has been invaluable." Justice Johnson's face lit up with a sense of accomplishment and pride. "Bradley, that's wonderful news. This town needs that bridge, and I believe it will make a world of difference. You've come a long way, and I want you to know how much I respect the steps you've taken. This program, this is the kind of change that goes beyond one person. It's a change for everyone in Oak Ridge." The three of them stood in the dimly lit hallway, an unexpected trio bound together by their shared commitment to making Oak Ridge a better place. They each represented different parts of the community: the youth, the law, and justice itself. Yet they had found common ground in their desire to transform and uplift their town. For a moment, silence enveloped them, a quiet understanding passing between them as they realized the impact of their efforts, their stories intertwined in ways they could never have predicted. As Lewis left to meet with friends, Bradley lingered, a contemplative look on his face. "Judge," he said slowly, "I've been thinking a lot about that day in the parking lot. It's strange, but in a way, I'm almost grateful for it. I've had to face things about myself that I never would have looked at otherwise. And I've learned that being part of this community isn't just about authority or enforcing rules. It's about building trust, about showing people that we're here for them, not above them. Justice Johnson nodded thoughtfully. Bradley, growth often comes from uncomfortable places. You've turned that experience into something meaningful, not just for yourself, but for this entire town. Remember, understanding doesn't come from a single moment, but from a lifetime of choosing to see others clearly and treating them with respect. Oak Ridge continued to evolve in the months that followed, with the Community Liaison Program becoming a model for neighboring towns. Officers worked alongside community leaders to address local issues and respond to residents' concerns in real time, breaking down the barriers that had once existed. Community events and forums were held regularly, allowing people of all ages and backgrounds to share their experiences, their challenges, and their hopes for the future. The town had become a place of active engagement, where diversity of thought was embraced, and differences were celebrated as strengths rather than obstacles. Justice Johnson's influence reached far beyond Oak Ridge. He was invited to speak at conferences, universities, and town halls across the state, sharing Oak Ridge's story and the lessons learned from his own journey. His speeches were filled with humility, wisdom, and encouragement, urging other communities to consider their own biases and to foster understanding among their residents. He spoke about the power of vulnerability, the importance of admitting mistakes, and the courage it took to face one's own biases head-on. His message resonated deeply, and he became a sought-after figure for those looking to make meaningful changes in their own towns. Despite the accolades and recognition, Justice Johnson remained humble, always redirecting the praise to the people of Oak Ridge and their commitment to unity. To him, the journey had never been about personal glory. It was about leaving a legacy that would inspire future generations, about laying the groundwork for a community that valued justice in every form, not just within the courthouse walls, but in every interaction, every choice, and every connection between people. One day, as he sat in his chambers, reflecting on the incredible journey that had unfolded over the past year, a letter arrived from a young woman in a nearby town. She had seen one of his speeches online and wanted to share her gratitude. "Your words showed me that I'm not alone," she wrote. "For the first time, I feel like there's hope for people like me to be seen, to be heard. Thank you for making me believe in change." Justice Johnson read the letter, feeling a swell of emotion. The impact of his work, of his life, was reaching people he had never met, people who found solace and courage in his story. It was a reminder of why he had chosen this path, why he had endured years of prejudice and struggle, and why he had continued to fight for justice even when it felt like an uphill battle. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over Oak Ridge, Justice Johnson took a walk through the town he had served for so long. He passed familiar faces, exchanging nods and smiles with people who had once been strangers, but now felt like family. He saw children playing in the park, elders sitting on benches sharing stories, young people engaged in animated discussions. Oak Ridge was alive with a new energy, a sense of belonging that had once seemed elusive. Justice Johnson knew that his time on the bench would eventually come to an end, but he felt a deep peace knowing that the work he had done, the seeds he had planted, would continue to grow long after he was gone. Justice Johnson's influence reached far beyond Oak Ridge. He was invited to speak at conferences, universities, and town halls across the state, sharing Oak Ridge's story and the lessons learned from his own journey. His speeches were filled with humility, wisdom, and encouragement, urging other communities to consider their own biases and to foster understanding among their residents. He spoke about the power of vulnerability, the importance of admitting mistakes, and the courage it took to face one's own biases head-on. His message resonated deeply, and he became a sought-after figure for those looking to make meaningful changes in their own towns. Despite the accolades and recognition, Justice Johnson remained humble, always redirecting the praise to the people of Oak Ridge and their commitment to unity. To him, the journey had never been about personal glory. It was about leaving a legacy that would inspire future generations, about laying the groundwork for a community that valued justice in every form, not just within the courthouse walls, but in every interaction, every choice, and every connection between people. One day, as he sat in his chambers, reflecting on the incredible journey that had unfolded over the past year, a letter arrived from a young woman in a nearby town. She had seen one of his speeches online and wanted to share her gratitude. "Your words showed me that I'm not alone," she wrote. "For the first time, I feel like there's hope for people like me to be seen, to be heard. Thank you for making me believe in change." Justice Johnson read the letter, feeling a swell of emotion. The impact of his work, of his life, was reaching people he had never met, people who found solace and courage in his story. It was a reminder of why he had chosen this path, why he had endured years of prejudice and struggle, and why he had continued to fight for justice, even when it felt like an uphill battle. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over Oak Ridge, Justice Johnson took a walk through the town he had served for so long. He passed familiar faces, exchanging nods and smiles with people who had once been strangers, but now felt like family. He saw children playing in the park, elders sitting on benches sharing stories, young people engaged in animated discussions. Oak Ridge was alive with a new energy, a sense of belonging that had once seemed elusive. Justice Johnson knew that his time on the bench would eventually come to an end, but he felt a deep peace knowing that the work he had done, the seeds he had planted, would continue to grow long after he was gone. As he turned down a familiar path, he saw a mural painted on a wall, an image of people of all ages, races, and backgrounds, standing together with the words, "Oak Ridge, where justice lives." The mural was a testament to everything the town had become, a symbol of hope, resilience, and unity. Justice Johnson stood before it, feeling a sense of fulfillment that words could hardly capture. The journey had been long, and the challenges had been great, but the community he loved was stronger, kinder, and more just than ever before. In that moment, he felt the presence of his mother, the woman who had instilled in him the belief that he was worthy, that he could make a difference. Her words echoed in his mind, as powerful as they had been all those years ago. "Son, remember, the world can judge you for what they see, but you must always know your own worth." He smiled, feeling her spirit beside him, knowing that he had honored her legacy in the truest way possible, by creating a world where others could know their worth too. As he walked away from the mural, his steps light and steady, Justice Johnson knew that Oak Ridge would carry on the torch. This town, once divided, now stood united, a place where justice was more than a duty. It was a way of life, a promise to every resident that they were seen, respected, and valued. And as long as Oak Ridge held true to that promise, Justice Johnson's legacy would live on, an enduring testament to the power of empathy, courage, and unwavering belief in the goodness of humanity.